you could think of MEL as actually a cycle of a set of processes, right? And I think that's the simplest, non-jargony kind of way to speak about this.
Shall we go through each of the parts of the cycle
Yeah.
and like go a little deeper into the questions
Yeah.
that were asked? So on the first part, which is defining intended impact, what does the M&E framework for an organization look like, and how does that fit in?
That really does depend on the organization and the intervention. It depends on two things. One is existing research and existing evidence there. That's why the whole idea of evidence-based programming, right? Which is that I also rely on existing evaluations that have been done. So I use the learnings from there. Second source of information for this is really people's lived experiences. And while this is not happening enough, ideally you do have people who've gone through these situations and these processes to tell you what kind of impact is actually helpful in that. And that is where context comes in, because existing research and evidence may be for another context. So how do I actually make it applicable for this context, or is there something that I have to find out fresh for this? So this is where frameworks like needs assessments and going onto the ground and understanding what people need is actually helpful. So once you have all of this information with you, the framework that's most helpful is to actually just answer to these two questions. What is the impact we want to have? Just start from there. How long do we think we'll take to achieve this particular impact? So time frames become critical.
What do you do by when?
What do you do by when? Exactly. And you can even think of it as a vision statement or a visioning exercise. So, a lot of these organizations have by X year, we will see XYZ. That is essentially what we want to see, probably at a broken down level for a particular intervention, assuming the organization has multiple interventions happening. So you start with that. So that is kind of how you define intended impact. Now, this is still a big visioning statement. It's also important to break down what does that actually mean. If I say I want to have carbon emissions cut down by 30%, where am I going to see this in action? That's when you kind of break that down to what that impact is for your context in your particular intervention. So that's kind of how you break it down from by 2030, I want carbon emissions out by 5%. What does that look like in my particular context? What is the particular thing you actually want to track? What is the metric that you actually hold as your North Star to say this particular intervention has been successful? That's another way to think about this.
And once you have the vision sorted, the next step was to then define essentially your M&E framework, right? So what would that entail? Is it like someone asked, is it just creating an Excel sheet?
The Excel sheet might be what it results in ultimately, but no. So what it actually involves is going backwards. Now, let's say I have decided that this is my North Star. This is the impact I want to have. I also know the indicator or the metric that I'm going to hold myself accountable for this. In order to achieve this, what are the different things I need to see? So that's where you go from this is the impact I want to have in 3 years. To achieve that impact, these are the outcomes I might need to sort of see in, let's say, 2 years. So you kind of go backwards in terms of time as well. And then you define what those things are. Again, I break them down into indicators. There is this beautiful TED talk around the danger of a single story. And I think you can apply the same in terms of MEL as well. The idea is also to make sure you have the right mix of metrics, because if you hold yourself true to only one and only, you might actually miss half the story. Which is why this design phase is as important as before rushing into what I want to collect. I spend a lot of my time on defining the metrics at different stages.
Can you give me with the literacy example, because I really like that. So can you break this down like this, saying I wanted this district to be literate, so now what does that look like?
So I have decided I wanted the district to be literate. The particular metric we decided was children in grades 1 to 3 are able to read at grade level. Now, I decided that the 3 things that need to happen for the children to be at grade level are: 1, the teachers in the classroom are equipped to actually deliver on pedagogy that will enable the children to learn.
Right.
So I break that down further into specific metrics for me to see. So I might look at it as teachers use XYZ methods in the classroom. Teachers feel confident. They're actually aware of pedagogies that happen, right? Or something like teachers are actually equipped. They feel prepared for all of this. The second thing might be parents at home know how to enable or support their children. What might that look like? It might look like parents actually asking their children about what they have read or spending time at home with their children. So I might decide that the metric here becomes amount of time parents spend at home. So that's a particular metric.
Right.
Again, I do want to emphasize that this is not about whether this is the right metric or not. These are just broad examples. Then another thing might be that children in that particular district have access to literacy materials.
Right.
So that might actually be children are going to a particular public library 3 times a week. Children are using libraries there. So another metric there could be time spent by children in a place, number of books borrowed, etc. Now this is again what needs to be achieved so that children are literate. I go one step backwards in terms of actual outputs, right? For the teachers to have that, we might make sure the teachers actually get access to continuous coaching and professional development. What metrics matter here? The percentage of teachers in that particular district who've actually been trained.
And how much they were able to absorb,
exactly,
and how much they were able to take it back to the classroom.
All of that. Similarly, with the parents, it might mean I do a parental awareness campaign. So how many of these parents actually attended that? How frequently did they attend? Similarly here, how many of these libraries have the books that the children actually need? So these are all the kind of immediate results of the program. Then you go to, I've decided that these are the few things I'm going to do. I'm going to have a teacher professional development and coaching program. I'm having a parental awareness campaign, and I'm going to make sure the infrastructure in terms of libraries and resources are full. What does that mean? How many sessions do I plan? How many resources do I put out? How much money am I spending? How much time am I accounting for? All of these are inputs and activities which you can also measure to see whether that's happening. In terms of monitoring, I might decide that I focus a lot more of my energy on my inputs that I spoke about, the immediate results, which are the outputs and what you're delivering and how it's being received, and maybe a little bit around those outcomes, just whether maybe teachers are absorbing, just whether parents feel the importance of something, just whether the resources are reaching. In terms of the evaluation is when I actually think of at what points in time do I expect to see change or results actually activate within parents, within teachers, within the infrastructure system. Finally, at what point do I know whether the children are actually making those changes in terms of literacy levels? So this is how you actually build your entire framework. You decide what matters, why it matters, what does tracking look like, and then we'll go into the rest of it when we speak about it. Yeah.
Right. And so which is why I find it very poignant what you said, that early on, when you are actually tracking, you are only tracking maybe just the inputs.
Yep.
And then slowly you might track few of the outputs because you don't expect to see that change in that shorter period of time. And I find it very helpful to always have the theory of change, the idea saying where are we going, fully clear in my mind. While in reality, I know that I'm not going to even be tracking that, because it would be silly of me to imagine that within 1 week of me distributing books, every child is literate.
Yes.
Right. And also, I feel like what you brought up brings up an important question of choosing the right metrics.
Yes.
And the fact that your M&E can always only be an approximation of reality.
Yeah.
It will never be the reality in itself, because reality is messy. And MEL is a way for you to try to control and make sense of that messiness. And like we said before, have some signal in the noise. What I have also been reading is that there is an increasing story around making sure that we don't carry our biases, especially when we are outsiders in any system, and take a more participatory approach to how we design these metrics and how we choose our M&E frameworks, right? Because what might seem logically correct may not actually be the reality of the context and of the situation. Yeah, right. So walk a mile in their shoes and talk to them about the mile that they have walked as you design your interventions and your M&E framework. Fair?
100%. And I think another thing, if I may add, is also that the difference between having MEL for the social impact space and maybe thinking of it in corporate speak is also that here you're dealing with human lives, right? A lot of the change we actually want to see is human behavior.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, we've made a lot of progress with respect to behavioral sciences, and we're borrowing a lot from there in terms of what we want to measure. But we are ultimately thinking of measuring things like how much trust do parents have in a government system, right? Whether it's education, healthcare, whatever it may be. It becomes very tricky, and I think quite hypocritical of us to claim that we have the perfect measures for all of that. And that's where I think what you said about working with people you're actually looking to impact becomes really critical. And the reason why I'm emphasizing so much on defining metrics is because the same indicator may have different implications in different spaces.
How so?
For example, let's say what grade level looks like in a rural part of town may need to be measured differently from an urban space. I'm not saying in any means that the children in rural spaces don't have the same ability. I'm just saying that the way you measure them or what that metric itself looks like may look differently in different spaces. There is a lot around how people behave in classrooms. What is accepted and standard behavior, right, may look very differently because of the equation. There again, you're trying to measure equation or engagement between a teacher and a child, and that what engagement looks like will look different in an India versus a Sri Lanka versus a Pakistan versus a Kenya versus the US. And sadly, a lot of our systems are still very, very borrowed systems, right? There's a lot happening in the, and for the lack of a better word, global south around these measurements and systems. But I think there is a lot still to be discovered in this space right now.
This also is a larger conversation that is happening around who is MEL for. Is it for the donor? For the donor to know that the money that they are giving, the philanthropists to know that the money that they are giving is being well used? Is it for the program teams to know that, and the organization to know that they're actually having meaningful impact? Or is it for the beneficiary to know what movement they are part of? Thinking about this question is important, and maybe the answer is it is for all of them, but it's different and should be treated differently for all of them. Very often, what happens is that you have, say, classroom observations that happen, and the teacher never gets to know what actually happened in the classroom observation. How did I do? Because if the point of the observation was to improve their performance, they need to know how their performance was. Very often, we always talk at the system level and forget the last mile actors and the beneficiaries who are the core of the dynamic around which our entire system is built.
And to be fair, I think when you initially asked me about learning loops are not just for the organization, right? We are collecting data from a lot of them. We are collecting their data, their opinion, their performance, their behaviors. What are we doing in terms of making sure that this data goes back in whatever form it may be? That is also learning, and that is also part of monitoring, ideally.
And yes, for all the people who are running organizations watching this video, yes, we agree that it's incredibly hard to do that, to build systems, especially at scale, which not just collect data, but also give it back in a way that they're able to absorb and understand. It's hard to do it multilingually. It's hard to do it simply enough so that it makes sense without misrepresenting. All of those are realities that exist. And yet, I think in all the work that I've been trying to do, it's always been striving and pushing to see what we can do, bare minimum at least, towards this.
100%. It's just being conscious of it, and I think it gets built over time. It's not something that happens easily as well.
So now moving onward from defining impact and defining your framework and breaking it down, next piece is actually getting the information, data collection. What does that look like? What are the different parts of data collection?
Great question again, because I think there are two parts to this. One, I determine what methods I want to pursue in terms of my research and my data collection. And the second is, how am I actually collecting this data, which is around the tools. Do I want to employ surveys? Do I want to employ interviews, etc.?
What are methods?
Methods include whether I want this to be mixed methodology. Do I want this to be just quantitative? Do I want this to be qualitative? It also includes evaluation methods, such as, do I want to do a pre-post? Do I actually want to do a controlled trial and evaluation? Do I want to do a quasi-experimental evaluation? So basically, what methods do I want to use to demonstrate whether my program is having impact or not?
Understood.
Why this matters is, depending on this particular method that I pick, I will decide the frequency of my data collection. I will also decide who I'm collecting data from.
Okay.
For example, if I have decided that I want to do a evaluation, like a full-blown quasi-experimental evaluation, I might decide it's not enough for me to see whether the group I am working with is having impact or not. But I want to see whether this impact is more than another group.
Okay.
So let's continue with this district example. We have now been working over here, but how do I know that another district is anyway having impact without the presence of this intervention?
Right.
In that sense, I may actually need to set up something called a control group. Right. That is why choosing your method becomes important. Similarly, do I want my methodology to be purely based on quantitative numbers, which is I care only at scale, right? Again, there are no rights and wrongs over here. It depends on what you're trying to measure. Or do I decide that I'm actually working with a very small group, so I actually need to go far more in depth? So I rely a lot more on qualitative methods. Or do I realize that I'm somewhere in between? I'm not working with the entire country, and I'm not working with one particular district,
right,
or block. So I can actually use a mix of quantitative and qualitative methods of data collection.
Understood.
So this is kind of how you start in terms of the methods. Once you have the methods and the metrics defined, form follows function. Now I'll know if these are 10 metrics I'm tracking, what are the best tools that will actually help me measure these particular metrics.
Got it.
So if I'm actually measuring a lot of quantitative methods that don't need a lot of people going and doing cross-checking, I just need people to report on something. There, a tool like a survey is helpful.
Right.
Because I send out a questionnaire, people respond to it. But I realize I don't want to just rely on people reporting something. I want to actually see behavioral change happen in front of me. So there, observational tools such as classroom observation or going into a public health clinic, seeing things in action. So using any sort of observational tool becomes critical over there.
Understood.
I know we get a lot of questions of whether should I use a survey, should I not? There is no easy answer to this. It has to come from what your metrics are and what method you decided to go ahead with.
So if I look at the district example, I guess what you're saying is I could look at, I take all the children in the district, and I want to see if their scores have improved over the years. Yeah. So then I will choose that I'm going to look at the government school record.
Yeah.
Right? The exam marks is what I will look at.
Yeah.
Or I might say, are these children doing better than the children in another district? So I'll have to look at the marks of both children.
Yes.
Or if my intervention had been looking at, are children growing more confident through literacy, etc. So then I might have to look at a different tool and a method by which, okay, this is starting to make more sense to me now. Thank you so much. So then you have the method sorted.
Yes.
And based on the methods, you're saying you then have the tools.
Yes.
So what are the tools that you use?
It usually is a mix of different things. So we spoke about a survey, which is a set of questions, typically between 12 and 15. And again, it may be a mix of open-ended and close-ended questions. You then also have interviews, right? Not unlike the conversation you and I are having. And that becomes helpful when you have a certain frame of what you want to collect, but you know you need to learn a lot more in depth. You want your participants to inform your learning. You don't go in with a fixed set of these are the questions and I want answers to these questions alone. You want to have some freedom in collecting insights from your respondents. There, an interview which is semi-structured becomes really helpful and is usually one-on-one.
Right.
Now, let's say I'm exploring group behavior. I want to see how people in a group interact with each other. Then something like a focus group discussion becomes helpful. And a lot of what you spoke about in terms of participatory research methods really were born with the idea of focus group discussions. And with focus groups, there are many, many creative ways of how you can do it. Again, I would urge people not to be creative for the sake of being creative, but to make sure that it fulfills the objectives of what you're trying to do. You also then have observational techniques, which really take the form of, I'm a silent follower over here. I'm just there. I want to see what's going on. I might have a set of questions for myself, but it's for me to absorb what's going on. So those are very helpful when, let's say, you're doing an audit. You're going into a village and you're trying to understand what is the infrastructural status, right? So I'm actually just relying on what I'm seeing and the status of some of the things that I'm seeing over there. So observational tools become really helpful. And this really relies on like ethnographic studies and things like this.
Right.
So these are like 4 broad tools that I have seen a lot of organizations.
So we're talking about surveys, we're talking about interviews.
Yes.
Focus group discussion, which is where you get some stakeholders as a group.
Yes.
And have a focused discussion with
Correct.
them. And the fourth is observational tools.
Yes.
Right? So, and observational tools are only of observation of situations and people or also of artifacts?
It can be of artifacts as well.
Okay.
Another thing, now that you brought up artifacts, another tool, and I'm also talking, this is all primary research tools, right? You can have secondary research, which is I'm relying on other people's data collection. So I would go into the Ministry of Statistics and look at the district maternal mortality rate figures. I don't need to personally go and collect them. But coming back to artifacts, yes, artifacts are helpful. Documents become really helpful. So I'm collecting information around what people have written. Another thing that becomes critical is, depending on the sector you're in, you might actually conduct assessments. So, right, like student assessment data, health assessments, etc. So all of that, health records are another example of artifacts as well. So yeah, these are the different tools one can employ. What tools you need, go back to your metrics. And one more thing that I think we probably touched on a little bit at the surface, but just to go back, when you're determining your frameworks, it's also helpful to say, if this is the framework, if this is my theory of change, what are some of the key questions I want the data to be able to answer for me? And having those questions, having all of your data actually centered around those questions is helpful because of the learning loops we spoke about. So again, those questions can direct your tools, you can direct your methods as well.
Again and again, I'm coming back to the idea of backward planning, right? It's really important that you know and align with all your stakeholders on what is the impact that you want to see and how do you think you're going to see it. And these are the probes that you put in to understand if you're moving towards in that direction or not. And like someone asked, what are some of the best practices while designing these tools? What are do's and don'ts that you have?
So one, I think it's important to picking the right tool is a really critical one. So if the question I want to answer is, to what extent did something reach then a survey becomes easy, right? Because someone can answer very yes or no, kind of very objective questions. If my question is, why has something worked or not worked, I may want to supplement my survey with in-depth tools. So an interview becomes important.
Right.
A focus group discussion becomes important because you're able to dig deeper into the responses. You can probe people further, which a survey does not give you the space to do. So picking the right tool becomes important. Number two, and this is something that one of my mentors taught me early, and I just thought it was brilliant, which is do not separate the people who are collecting the data completely from people who are doing the analysis. So when you are building the tool, think about how you would analyze. How will I use this question? Mapping each question to the tool, to the objective you're trying to actually measure. What metric am I trying to measure? Is every single question in my tool serving a purpose? Because you will have several good to have questions, right? Each, like all questions sound fantastic. There's nothing wrong with the question per se, but is it serving its purpose? So that becomes a second best practice. Third, I have realized, and this is, I think, particularly in the context of India, when language becomes important, a lot of things get lost in translation. So I do think that it's important to perhaps sometimes build tools in the language that you are meant to collect them,
Right.
because we have seen this happen several times, right? And then it loses the purpose for the data collection. So I think these are the questions that I would ask myself while I'm building a particular tool. Pilots, so important. Again, I am not here to kind of be on a high horse and say it's always possible, but as much as it is, it really helps, because it is much better to spend extra time at the front end than to collect all of this data and collect wasteful data. So pilots would be another best practice that I would suggest.
And so to all M&E professionals watching this, one of the things that I think number 2 that you said matters so much, realize that with every survey or every focus group discussion that you're making happen, there is human time and effort that goes into it. You may not yourself be the surveyor, but someone is going out and doing it, and people's time and energy and goodwill is being taken for making this happen. So I really like the idea of ensuring that every question that you put in there has clarity on why you are asking that question, and it is well connected to that, right? And if possible, I would totally say do a few of the surveys or observations yourself first, or while it's happening, because the color commentary that comes from just having seen things on ground is so hard to replicate when you're just looking at an Excel sheet. Yeah.
100%.
And so just before we get to the section on insight generation and discussion, I just wanted to also, so there is a typical frame that I've seen always the Excel ending up having. Tell me if I'm missing something, right? But essentially, serial number, what is the question we're trying to answer? What are the metrics that we are looking at? What is the target measure for it? What did we find? And what is the method that we are deploying? And in what frequency are we deploying these methods? Is this the master table that will help you have everything?
Yes. The other thing I would just add to it is how frequently do I intend using this data? Right? Because that is what completes the learning loop.
Yes.
Because when you're deciding, I'm going to collect this data as frequently, are you actually going to use this data as frequently? If I'm going to go and collect data from someone every month, am I going to actually follow through and see this? Or is this a good to have because I want to report it externally? Right? So I think another thing I would add is how frequently, what is my plan to actually use this data?
That is powerful, and that I wish I had added that to a lot of my Excels. So coming to the insight generation and learning section, right? First question is, should we be replacing the name MEL with monitoring, evaluation, and reporting?
No, because they are two different things.
Right.
I'm very fully cognizant of the fact that there is a lot of external reporting that many of our organizations are required to do for many justifiable reasons. But the core of MEL is for the organization and for the team and for the program, and ultimately for, I don't know whether the word beneficiary is right to use, but ultimately for the people we want to impact, for those lives. Given that, I don't think this is about reporting.
Sure. So, I just wanted to bring that up, hence brought it up, because one of the grouses that I saw a lot of the professionals had is that there is so much reporting that we have to do, and that is all that we are doing, which is collect data, make reports that no one's going to read. So tell us a little bit about what is this section really, what should it be about?
No, I'm so glad that you brought this up, because I think this is something that a lot of people keep coming and asking for. So let's say now you've collected all of this information, you're beginning to analyze. And this section is also about analysis and meaning making, which is, so what? Why does all of this matter? What are we going to do with this? So here I would actually separate insight generation from reporting, which are both equally important processes. So I'll get the data. This is where you want to make decisions around how do you want to analyze it? Who's analyzing this information? Are you leveraging technology? What is the story you want to tell based on what you're learning? Right? So I'm collecting all of this information. I analyze the data. I probably want to have some sort of reflection plan with my organization and the different teams. And this is where I think the program teams fully come back into the loop, because ultimately, when you are working with MEL, yes, you should have context, you should have investment and all of that, but people on the ground are best suited to making meaning out of something. Now, when I look at a number, and even like a sentence, 50% of our respondents said that they do not eat 3 meals a day. And they said that the food being provided to them is not tasty. Now, me sitting in Bangalore will have absolutely no value to make out of that, but someone actually working on the ground will have a lot more. We can actually get into why. Okay, what does this actually mean? Where is this coming from?
Culturally, they eat 2 times a day.
For example, So lots of those kinds of insights will not come from data. And that is where I think lived experiences matter. Your own personal equation with a government official may matter, right? So that's where the reflection planning comes in. Like that might mean I actually have people in my team interact with each other about this. Does this data make sense to you? Is there something that actually seems very off? Because that could be, right? And that could actually then we might actually realize it generates more questions than answers, which is equally important, right? You may not get all the answers here. So again, you go back to those questions you define at the beginning to say what questions do I want to answer from those data points, and this is where you try to answer some of those data points. Then you generate insights for now and for the future as well. What does this mean for us to do differently in the next phase of our program now? And if something has actually ended, what does this mean when we are designing something new? Then we also go into reporting, which is what do we want to share externally? And of course, we have to be as honest as we need to be here. So what do we want to share? What makes sense for an external person without context? And I have to say, as someone who's been working in the sector, that is the hardest skill, I think, because something will make sense for me, but someone who's not worked in the program at all, what makes more sense to them? And reporting is not just for donors and a power equation there. It's also your contribution to the field, right? Because ultimately, thinking about the evidence we spoke about, this is also going into that evidence bank for someone else to pick up. So what is the reporting we want to make to someone who is funding us, but also what is the story we want to share for someone who could learn from our experience?
So can I put that as there's data that you collect? You analyze it and there is analysis. From the analysis, you make inferences. From the inferences, you draw out insights. And these insights get turn into reports that you generate, as well as they feed into changes in action that you will drive, right?
You also then go back to your original theory of change. You said that if X happens, Y will happen, and then Z will happen. And 9 times out of 10, that exact linearity doesn't happen. But to what extent is this chain reaction actually reflecting on the ground. What does this mean for our own theory that we set out? What does that also kind of go back to the framework? So that's also part of this learning loop that you have.
And I agree with what you said earlier, that if I look at what an MEL person should have, I do think that on one side is the ability to conceptualize and abstract, and then to analyze and draw out insights. But I think the third part also matters, and I like calling it holding up the mirror, right? Do you have the ability to then focus on what matters and communicate that and hold up the mirror to the program team saying, hey, this is what needs to change, and to hold up a mirror to the organization saying, hey, this is as far as you've gotten today. And so I feel like being able to see all the beauty and the what's is something that requires skill. To share it in a way that nobody feels affronted. Nobody feels like we've been doing all this hard work. How can you say that it's not working? Right? So I do think that the simplification communication aspect really matters. And love what you said around who it's for, that it's not just for the donors. Right. So yes, it is monitoring, evaluation, and learning, which is the core point, not necessarily monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. And tip for making reports, I would say first focus on what your core points are, your core insights are, and from that, provide your supporting data arguments. Don't start with here is all the data and this is the insight that comes from it. I often find that especially decision makers like organization leaders or donors are looking to understand the insights, and they will verify whether the insights are right by looking at the data. Fair to say?
I think very fair to say. Also, I think another gripe that I've often heard is that it becomes extremely jargony, right? So I think we often mistake rigor from difficult. We conflate the two.
Right.
It can be rigorous without it seeming very hard for someone else to understand. And I think that's where people have to make decisions around, yes, I report on statistical significance, but is that all I report on? I also then have to translate what does statistical significance actually mean for the person who is reading this and trying to make meaning out of this as well.
There was a government official who I was working with, and we were designing a tech system together, and he said something that I feel is true for MEL also. He said that it can be as complicated as you want in the back end. You could have 100 indicators. We were looking at a teacher competency rubric, right? You can have a super complex rubric and data and everything plugged in at the back. But to the person who's looking at your interface, it should be super simple. It should just be 5 things that they see. And that's always how good design looks like. So that's, I think, true of MEL reports as well.
100%.
And one question that I have to ask you, are randomized controlled trials the gold standard, and should I always be looking to do one? What skills do I need as an MEL professional? What is the impact that AI is going to have on MEL?